speaker, and so we're going to get started so we don't take up any of his time. So let's move on to housekeeping. So as you remember that all of this is Zoom. You can get whatever Zoom links you need from your schedule. We've been sending those out. You should have received one this morning. And then you also know that if you have any questions, you can ask by putting it in chat. And you can turn your captioning on and off using the little symbol with the 2 CCs. We hope you've enjoyed being able to get this information in these variety of ways, and we are looking forward to the rest of today. Okay, moving on. So what is happening today? Well, following this very brief introduction, we have Jose Rosario, and his presentation is entitled Empowered to Rise. Then following that, we have a technology and social media session, workforce development, youth collaboration, and inclusive design. So I hope you will attend as many of these sessions as you can. All right. Finally, we wanted to share with you what the artist did while she's been with us. This is SciFar Professional Development Event. It's very fun, and I believe you will have access to these and can use them if they're helpful to you. Do you want to show the other one? There we go. So I think it's really interesting to see all the pieces that have been added to this. So, all right. And then it's time for evaluation. Shall we do a drum roll, everyone? I know you're excited. You may use this QR code, or we will send it to you, we will send it to you in email as well. Steph, did I miss anything on this one?
Nope. We just wanted to make sure folks had the code in case we missed you at closing later today, but you will also see it in your email.
Yeah, we'll send it to you in email as well. So, all right. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Perkins. I again want to thank all of you for being a part of this professional development event. It has been terrific, and I am thrilled that you're here. Dr. Perkins?
Thanks, Dr. Borden, or if you're okay, I'll just call you Lynn and you can call me Danny. Listen, I'm really excited. I didn't know Jose before he jumped on the call with us, and he really was rolling with the punches, engaging already with us. So I think it's going to be a great presentation. I'll read his bio. Jose Rosario is a speaker, an author, but above all else, an advocate. As a member of many diverse identity groups, Jose recognizes that there are common experiences that can bring people together, and that taking stock of who we are gives us power. As a mental health professional, Jose understands that this empowerment and the creation of a space to be vulnerable can lead to significant growth and change. Currently, Jose is a clinical psychology PhD student at Clark University, where his work focuses on disparities in effective mental health care after violent events that target specific identity groups. If that wasn't enough, Jose is also the founder of the Phoenix Empowered, where he shares his story to inspire others to acknowledge their identities, share their stories, and empower those who are underrepresented to rise. I can honestly say I'm extremely excited. I was excited before I met him, but now that I know him, I do believe I'll be taking some notes. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Jose and thank him for sharing his wisdom.
That was one of the nicest introductions ever. I mean, I don't think I ever want to be introduced again. I think you've kind of set the bar. Thank you all for having me with you. And also, side note, I have to change that headshot. That was before I grew a beard, and it just feels very different from who I am now, post-pandemic. At any rate, I'm Jose Rosario. I am here to speak with you all today. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I always like to start by just acknowledging that I'm coming at this through a lens of being a Latino man who identifies as having a disability, utilizing a wheelchair, as a member of the LGBTQ+ community, happy Pride, among other identities that all inform the work that I do and the ways in which I view the world. Thank you. All feel free to please drop questions in the chat. I will be answering questions in the breakout session after the talk. Um, I'll try and answer questions during the talk. That hasn't worked really well for me in the past, but I will do the best I can. So thank you all for having me. The way that I like to sort of contextualize my talk is through talking about my story, because I could come here and share data with you, but these are living, breathing experiences. And today I'm going to be talking to you about my journey through finding my identities and finding my place in the world, the journey that's still happening, and the role that others have played in that. So as cliche as it sounds, I'm going to start at the very beginning. I'm going to start at birth. And so I was born very premature. I was born at 2 pounds and 1 ounce, and within a week was down to 1 pound. So my grandmother always told me that she could hold me in the palm of her hand. Now she is Puerto Rican, so she exaggerates, and so who knows if I actually fit in the palm of her hand, but that's the story I was told. And we spent a lot of time in the NICU. You know, I was in the incubator for 4 months, and so my parents were really young. And I share that because it's important. They were young, and English was their second language. And so truly, when everything was going on and I was born so early, they didn't know what to do. They weren't prepared for that. And so the hospital kept saying to them, no one is going to judge you if you decide you can't do this. If you decide that this path isn't for you, that is okay. You just need to make the decision. And my parents were kind of like, what do you mean? Of course this is for us. This is our child. This is who we got. Like, we're not gonna, ship them off or ask for another one on layaway. Like, that's not how this works. This is our child. And so they knew that they wanted to stick with this journey. And they did. For those 4 months in the hospital, things were moving in a direction that was uncertain, but also moving forward. And eventually I was able to go home. Now, things changed and took sort of a dramatic turn a week after I got home. And I've now gotten permission to share this story, but when I first shared it, my mom hadn't okayed it, and that was such an interesting experience. But a week later, my mom was in the shower, and I was in the crib, and she heard a gasp on the baby monitor and ran to the room. By the time she got there, she found me blue in the crib. I had stopped breathing. So she rushed out of the house, and my aunt following behind her with a towel, wrapping her up and being like, what are you doing? And everyone, the entire family, because we all live near each other, as true Latinos do, we all lived near each other and traveled to the hospital. All jokes aside, it was 12 minutes and 54 seconds. I'm sorry, 11 minutes and 54 seconds, almost 12 minutes without oxygen. Now, for those of you who might study neurology or neuropsychology, you know that after 4 minutes, the brain begins to die. The neurons and the connections start to diminish and function is impaired. And so doctors kept saying to my parents, with the amount of oxygen he's lost, we have no idea what his future is going to look like. Again, if you cannot handle this, no one is going to judge you because we have no idea what this is going to look like. And my parents were like, you need to stop saying that. We're going to stick to this. Like, that's not changing. This is our kid. And they knew that whatever was going to happen, we were all going to adapt together. And I share that because I feel very fortunate and very privileged that my parents were willing to be flexible and willing to learn and grow with me. Right? Not a lot of people, or not everyone, has this experience of people wanting to navigate such an unknown system. My parents didn't understand the medical system. They didn't understand how to get access to things I would need or even what I would need. And English being their second language, even more so. How are they going to conceptualize what's going on? But nonetheless, they stuck to it. And I was a happy kid. I enjoyed my family. I enjoyed being around them. But around 6 years old was when I started to have that realization of, oh, wait a minute, I'm not like everyone else. The kids around me are running on a trampoline or they're, running around a track, and I am here just kind of sitting. And that's different. That's weird. And I didn't have words for why it felt weird, but I just wanted to be like everyone else. And I remember sitting in my closet and crying and thinking, why me? Why did I have to be different? Why did God or some higher power make me different? And I was angry and I was sad. And my parents often were like, you're not different, you're you, all the inspirational stuff that parents tell you when they want you to feel better. And I was like, yeah, mom, great. But also, like, I'm different and it feels weird. And that was something that I grappled with. And here's where we get into sort of the intricacies of mentorship, of support. When I was about 7 or 8, we were at a doctor's appointment, one of many. I often say while other kids were at Chuck E. Cheese, I was in and out of hospitals getting surgeries and doing things. But early on in this, we were at the doctor's office, and the doctor looked at my parents right in front of me and said, whatever dreams you have for this kid, you're going to have to reassess. He's not going to be the kid you want him to be. He might end up being a vegetable, which is a derogatory term that we no longer use. But you can imagine me being an impressionable child, hearing someone who's supposed to know how to fix things or know how to make things better, saying, you're not going to accomplish anything. It was at that moment that I felt defeated. I thought, what's the point? What's the point of doing this? What's the point of trying to, move forward, get more mobility, or even just doing things like physical therapy and occupational therapy? What's the point of all of it? And my parents, because they are stubborn, they like to think that I'm the stubborn one, but they don't think about where I got it from. We're like, no, this is not the life we're going to define for you. And I remember leaving that appointment and them saying, you will never see that doctor again. And at first I thought, oh, maybe they don't want me to see that doctor again because the doctor knows that there's no point in coming to doctor's appointments. But in reality, what it was they knew that I couldn't be defined by anyone else. That is exactly the power of words. That those doctors' words hurt me, and they made me think and question my ability, question my sort of space in the world. And yet my parents' support is what pulled me through that. So I share this because this is an important theme, I think, in my life, but in the lives of so many people, thinking about how the words and the actions of others can really change the trajectory of our lives. So after that day, there seemed to be this sort of pivot towards really going to doctor's appointments and doing surgeries and doing things that would better my life in whatever way we could. It was always about what is the quality of life looking like. And so that was the plan. And we moved forward that way and things were pretty great, I would say. I was able to start walking with canes and walking with a walker and slowly but surely made advancements. But you see, I was still different. I was still struggling with that sense of feeling like something about this doesn't fit. Things people are talking about or doing, I don't get to do. And so I feel kind of like an outsider. And that impacted me, but more so as I got older in adolescence, right? I don't know about any of you, but I don't want to be a teenager ever again. And I'm very fortunate that I don't have to be because it's hard. It's hard to interact socially with the world. And a lot of the time, it felt to me like the world wasn't built for me, which is a really, really sort of powerful realization that could be negative and or positive. We'll get to that. For a young adolescent, right? That the world is not built, that you don't fit into this box. Now, I want to add in the added layer of as an adolescent, I was also coming to terms with my own sexuality. And so talk about a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts and being like, I don't know where I fit in the world and I can't go to parties because my friends are like, well, there's stairs. And so I wasn't interacting socially with people as much. So how did I cope with it? Well, I coped as any adolescent would. I avoided because that's what we do as humans. We avoid the unpleasant feelings because we don't have the language or the skills and tools to address that. And so I threw myself into advocacy, which looking back, of all the things I could have done to avoid, this is a good one. But I threw myself into really wanting to make a difference in my community. I threw myself into peer advocacy, talking about substance use, drunk driving, talking about risky decision making, and became really involved. To the point where this is my claim to fame, I was the youngest member of the Mayor's Substance Abuse Prevention Council in history. In fact, the youngest member on payroll at City Hall in history. And I will hold that every day because it was so cool walking around with my little binder being like, yeah, I know what I'm talking about. I did not know what I was talking about. But I threw myself into this work. And around my senior year of high school, so really like deep in that adolescent identity exploration, something happened to me that was positive. I should preface that way. But it was my senior year. It was near the end of the year. It was AP exams. And we were hosting a community event on drunk driving. Now, I know on the East Coast, this is pretty prevalent where, high schools will have a car in the front lawn that has gotten into an accident and say things like, here's the result of some risky decision making. And so we were going to have an event that was like a virtual simulation of what it's like to drink and drive. And we were raising money for this event and I was running point and really excited because it was the first time I got to run point on an advocacy event. And I got an email from a woman asking to meet with me. So I said, yeah, sure, come to my high school because I'm in high school, can't just leave. Come on over and we'll have a conversation. And she came and tried to hand me a check. And this woman really wanted to be a part of that experience and said, I want to support this cause. And I was like, we've covered this through grants. You don't have to worry. It is okay. I don't want you to feel pressured. And she said, no, you don't understand. I need you to take it. And so we took the check. And she said, and I have something else for you. And she started to tell me a story. Her son was killed by a drunk driver and left on the side of the road. And that's how she lost her son. And she handed me a bookmark. And she said, my son was a writer. He was a poet. And on the back of the bookmark was one of his poems. I still get emotional thinking about it and talking about it, but emotions are good. And the last line of the poem was, I am a shaper of destiny. And I said to her, I really like that line. And she said to me, yeah, my son always said that he was a shaper of destiny, that the way that he interacted with people would help him make an impact in people's lives. And it was at that moment that I knew that that's what I wanted to be when I grew up, a shaper of destiny. However that came about, that was the role for me. I wanted to be a person who told people, I believe in you, because I knew what it was like to be told, I don't believe in you. I knew what it was like to feel like I didn't belong. And I wanted to make sure nobody ever felt that way again. And so I credit this woman a lot for that sort of realization. And in fact, my senior quote that year was, I am a shaper of destiny. And so I made sure that I spoke it into existence. So at that point, I was already sort of working in the field of psychology, doing research as an intern, and really starting to get experience of like, what are risky decisions? What is mental health? And really immersing myself, because I was also that weird kid at 13 who said to everybody, I want my PhD in clinical psychology. And everyone kept saying to me, slow your roll. Let's focus on graduating high school, or let's focus on getting a bachelor's degree. And at that point, I was feeling kind of defeated. I was kind of like, oh, you don't believe in me. So this woman, when she talked to me about being a shaper of destiny, that pivoted everything. That was the moment where I was like, oh, it doesn't matter if people are telling me you're dreaming too big or dreaming too far into the future. I'm going to do this. And there's that stubbornness again. This is going to happen. So I went to college. I studied psychology and got the opportunity to get another degree in chemical dependency and addiction studies. So I was also training to be an addictions counselor, and really training to sit with people in the hardest moments of life, in the hardest moments, in the painful moments, in moments that are deep rooted in trauma, violence, and pain. And I loved doing this work. I loved sitting in this work. And frankly, the person you see in front of you is not the person that was doing this work. The person that was doing this work loved this work, but also felt strangely disconnected. My experiences didn't matter. I was the clinician, the blank slate. I was there with no sort of presence other than being there for the person in front of me. My opinions, thoughts, values didn't matter. Much less, my identities didn't matter. I was still heavily closeted, still not sure what was going on or how I fit into the world. And I didn't ever engage with that part of myself because it didn't matter for the work I was doing. I genuinely think that as a young college student and older adolescent, I thought I could go through the world without having to engage with this at all because I was serving the community. So what's the point of doing that internal reflection? That wasn't the case. I had a professor who was a social psychologist, and she kept saying to me, she's like, you're a social psychologist, but you want to call yourself clinical. That's okay for now. But one day you're going to realize that maybe you're a little bit of both. And I often said to her, you're joking. I'm a clinician through and through. This is what I do. And I would come to class and have my suit on for doing presentations and pointing out data. And one day she said to the class, have you ever thought about how different communities are going to respond to trauma and to other events differently? Have you thought about the role of identity? In fact, have you thought about your identities? And I was like, what do you mean? My identities, they impact the work we do? They impact how we see the world? Hold on, what's going on? And she started talking about things like racism and heterosexism and ableism and things that like I knew I had sort of experienced and seen, but never really had the language for. Spoiler alert, that's the first class I ever came out in. It's the first class that I said, oh, wait a minute. These experiences of feeling different, these experiences of not belonging, those are the experiences that guide my empathy. It's the reason I feel so connected to this work. And I've completely ignored that. I've completely ignored that because I understand the pain of feeling like you don't belong or feeling like you can't belong, that I have an entry point into this clinical work. And I had this sort of realization of the research I've been doing and collaborating on has diversity, has never thought about identity. That doesn't fit into this sort of box that research has been for me. So what does this mean for my career? And I took a step back and said, I can't apply to grad school right now. I feel too confused about what's going on. And after my senior year, about a week or two after, I was asked to do a talk about mental health. And I reverted back to my old ways. I was like, yes, I know what suit I'm gonna wear. I know what data I'm gonna use. How many charts do you want? What's the color scheme? All of these questions. And the group looked at me and they said, no, we don't want that. We want you. We want you to tell your story. And I remember being like, well, crap. You really stepped in it now because you already said yes. So now what are you going to do, kid? And so I panicked. I was like, what does this mean? I can't do this. I can't share my story. There are parts of my story that I don't even know. And I was like, well, I'm going to have to come up with something. Maybe I can do something kind of surface level. I'll talk about my experience using a wheelchair. People can see that. And we'll just talk about accessibility. We'll talk about ramps. And I avoided doing a presentation. I avoided getting slides ready until the day before. Bad choice. The day before, I'm working on slides and I start to cry because it was the first time I had seen my story in its totality up until that moment. I graduated college with 2 degrees. And this person early on told me I wasn't going to do anything. How did I get here? And it was that moment of this story matters. If not to anyone else, it matters to me. And how have I been so blind to just ignore the fact that like all of these pieces came together? And so I was like, how am I going to do this talk tomorrow if I can't even look at these slides without crying? What's going to happen? So fast forward to the next day, it's time for the talk, and I'm backstage and I'm like, where is the exit? How do I get out of here? How do I sneak out of here? I'm on wheels. I could go faster than most of these people. They can't chase me into the parking lot. It'll be fine. And I'm looking for the way to get out. And then I realized there is no getting out because at this point, I've already seen now that identity has an impact. And so I have to do this. I have to. How am I going to call myself committed to well-being if I don't do this? So I remember I took a deep breath and said, let it be what it'll be. And I went out on stage. Now, I can't tell you what I talked about. All I can tell you is that I told my story in front of 300 or 400 people. And I talked about feeling different and the impact that that had. But more importantly, how being different was made even more difficult because of the words and actions of other people. You see, we have a choice. We have a choice to create either shapers of destiny, or we have a choice to limit people. And both of those things can happen in different facets of our life and different times of our life, but we all have a role to play. And so I told my story, every painful moment of it, every good moment of it, and something happened, something clicked inside of me. And it felt like for the first time, I was living in my truth is really what it was. I was living my full self and talking about mental health outside of this one size fits all kind of model that everybody's going to experience things the same way, that there aren't systemic things or systemic discrimination and violence that impact the experience of folks across the country and across the world. It was almost like I was stepping away from this antiquated version of what mental health looked like. And it really excited me. And so I got off stage and I was like, that was, what was that? Was that feeling? I feel so just reflective and thoughtful and pensive and grateful. And suddenly I was bombarded by people who were crying and hugging me. And I was so overwhelmed by the fact that like this experience that I thought saying, I wish kid were here because they're going through something very similar, or I know what it's like to not be accepted. And there was this feeling of, oh, wait a minute, I'm not alone in this. I am one person within a larger community that has experienced a lot of very similar things. And that was a really powerful realization for me. Yeah. And so I decided that I couldn't stop speaking. that speaking was something that had to continue. I was bit by the bug and I wanted to keep speaking. So I did another talk at a university, and this talk was a keynote. And again, I brought slides because I wasn't ready to go off slides. I mean, I'm okay with shaping mental health, but I'm not okay to go completely rogue just yet. So I brought my slides and I still wore my suit, and I did a talk about how to be an advocate. Now, mind you, I think that I was trying to fit into this mold. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about inequity without talking about systemic issues because I was afraid to go there. Nonetheless, I did the talk, and there was somebody in the front row crying the entire talk. And I was like, what did you do? Like, what is going on? So I put on my clinical hat and I went over and I just said, hey, just checking in. I noticed you were crying in the front row, wanted to see what was going on with you. And the person started crying even more. And I was like, oh, I stepped in it now. I'm going to get escorted out of here. I don't know what I just did. And immediately I was like, what is going on? And the person pulled themselves together, looked at me and said, you're the first person to ask me how I'm doing in over 10 years. And that hit me like a bucket of ice water because that level of just checking in with people made this person feel heard and seen. And that's when I committed my life to doing this work and developing the Phoenix Empowered. We have a choice. As mentors, as people in other people's lives, we have a choice to make space where people feel seen, heard, and valued. That's my mission in life, is to go to communities that have not been included in the mental health conversation and say, your experiences matter. And sometimes the larger conceptualizations of mental health are not going to fit into those experiences because we are not there. We don't know what these experiences are. I don't know what these experiences are, even though I hold many of these identities that informed how I look at the world. There's no way that I can see them all. And so my goal is to create these empowerment spaces. And that's where I've gotten to where I am today. So I'm getting my PhD now, finally, in clinical psychology. 2 years in, about to start my third year in a month. And I'm looking at trauma. I'm looking at cultural trauma, so community and systemic trauma among minoritized groups. And I could not be happier. This is where I feel I need to be, because this is where I feel like I get to integrate my true self and the work that I want to do. And aside from that, because clearly I drink plenty of coffee and have so much energy, I get to come around and do talks, whether virtually or in person, and go to communities and say, mental health doesn't have to be a one size fits all. Your experiences have value. And we often tell people we want to hear from you. When we're doing research, we often think, oh, this grant's going to be representative because we're going to go into the community. But how do we know the community wants to talk to us? How do we know the community wants us to get involved? You see, there are all of these sort of missing pieces that we don't think about when we do advocacy. And the reason this organization is called the Phoenix Empowered is intentional. Because I believe that those people who break us down can sometimes break us down to our bare essentials, the ashes, so to speak. They break us down and we have to kind of put ourselves back together and rise up despite that, or in spite of that. The piece that was missing, though, is that when communities or individuals are told all the time, you can't do this, you can't rise, you can't, meet this expectation, you won't be here, or you're not seeing yourself represented, then you're not going to believe it. So we have to empower folks to feel like they can rise before we can expect people to rise and make change. Now, this all feels relevant to the work that you all are doing because we are empowering, hopefully, youth to rise. We're in a space of what I like to call social action, maybe even civil unrest. And this new generation is holding us all accountable to how we can make change in the world. They want to see that we're thinking about the world with complexity and nuance. They want to see themselves and others represented in the work that we all are doing. We have the opportunity to create these empowerment spaces. And if my story teaches you anything today, I hope that it teaches you what the value is behind those empowerment spaces, behind telling people we believe in you, behind making sure that when we go into a community, we're actively listening. We're listening to the needs and acknowledging and representing the fact that there's been mistrust. People have been harmed by people. Take this doctor, for example. Doctors in our society are seen as the people who know, They're knowledgeable. They're willing to tell us prognosis. They're there to kind of guide us on a path. So this doctor who told me I wasn't going to amount to anything, she would know if I was going to amount to anything. There's mistrust there. I'm starting to navigate in my own work as a therapist. How do we navigate the fact that people are uncomfortable with mental health in particular, with coming in and sharing deep parts of themselves? The work that we all do requires us to engage with vulnerability. That I have now found is the missing piece to the work that I've been doing. When I got on that stage for the first time, that was the magic. It was the vulnerability. It was the finally acknowledging the pieces of me that for a long time were hidden, or maybe just I didn't have the language for it. But at that moment, it all started to come together. So let's talk a little bit about where we can all be a part of this work. I think it's multifaceted. Systemically, we want to make sure that we're funding research and doing research that impacts communities, that it acknowledges differences. Because here's the funny thing about difference, is that it scares us. We think that difference means we don't understand it or we don't know the experience. And in some cases, the nuance of that is true. We don't understand it, and we should be willing to learn. But there's also something really interesting, at least about human behavior, is that we all know what it's like to be afraid. We all know what it's like to feel sad. We all know what it's like to feel hopeful, and maybe sometimes feel hopeless. We understand these basic human experiences. And so tackling difference is not necessarily positioning yourself and another community. It's positioning the fact that there are complexities here that you don't know yet, that you're excited to learn about. And so systemically thinking about how does the work that we're doing contribute to knowledge, contribute to well-being, contribute to building trust. On an interpersonal level, particularly with youth are in a space of identity navigation, identity differentiation from their peers. They're really looking for how do I fit into this social world? As I said earlier, even though it was jokingly, being a teenager kind of sucks, y'all. It's not enjoyable, at least not for me. I definitely think it was not my cup of tea. But there are people out there, all of you on this call, who can help guide that process for individuals who feel like maybe they've never belonged, or maybe they no longer know where they belong. You have the opportunity to be a shaper of destiny. You have the opportunity to really guide something and create an entry point for people. And it sounds like from the work that you're doing these things already. And something to reflect on might be, how do we continue to do this work and amplify the work that we're doing? But I'll leave that to your reflection and sort of thought process. So where am I going next? Because I've shared a lot about the past and present, and I want to make it clear that this talk is not meant to be motivational. It's not meant to be like, oh, look at him, he persisted among all of these barriers. While that may be true, what I want you to see is that I'm a human who experienced complexity, who experienced identity navigation, and is still going through this process of understanding who he is. It's not so much a go you, let's give you a trophy, you know. And I share this because when we think about things like disability, when we think about things like other forms of diversity, it is often the case that one person will come in with the expectation that their story will sort of change the world. And I am one person who represents a myriad of communities. So I want to be clear that the work continues. My goal is to plant a seed and maybe to inspire change, but not necessarily to make it all about me. It's about something much bigger. So my goal is mental health equity on a global scale, that across all communities, people feel heard and valued and respected, and they feel like they belong somewhere. And this is my challenge to all of you. In the work that you're doing, let's be intentional about making sure people belong. And that's not just saying, I'm an ally, I'm going to, you know, do this sort of performative piece of posting things or doing things. That's a piece of it. But it also means sitting with discomfort. It also means questioning things that you might not know about, doing your own learning. And so my hope is that we continue this conversation because it is long-term work. Okay. I feel like I've been talking at you all for quite some time. I want to take a second and see if something about, especially that last part about what we can do, if anyone has questions and wants to put it in the chat to make sure that part felt clear, because I think that's the take-home message, is that we all have a role here. And I'll probably answer more specific questions in the breakout session. Yes, every story matters. Yes, absolutely. Well, it seems like maybe it was clear, which is a good thing. I want it to be clear. That means that I'm doing my job. So I'm glad. I do just want to point out that having spaces like this, while we think it may be common, it's not. It's not common that we get to have conversations about identity, about the work that we're doing, and about creating safe or empowering spaces. So thank you all for creating this space, for showing up, because it's not common that groups will do this, at least not yet. Hopefully we get to a space where this becomes part of our daily conversation, and we might be shifting that way, but we still have a ways to go. So thank you all for being present in this space and for listening to my story, which often has so many different dimensions, but I really appreciate you listening to it. And most of all, thank you for having me here and for committing to this work. I could not be more excited by all of this.
Well, I want to take a minute and say thank you. And we have about 8 minutes. If you have a question, I know we're going to do questions and breakout, but some of you will be in others. So if you have other questions, you can use these 8 minutes that way, or 7. I see we're getting all kinds of comments. Okay, well, see.
I was going to say one thing that resonated with me. I know yesterday we had a conversation about working with different populations and creating true partnerships with folks who are in vulnerable populations or populations that aren't often represented in our work. And that was also something we talked about on Monday with Dr. Weston Sarden, was about how can we make sure that our space and extension is representative when the folks that are in it and coming up in it might not be as diverse as they could be, or how can we encourage diversity in our space? I don't know if any of the folks who are attending had kind of similar things that resonated around those conversations, but when you were mentioning kind of making sure that you're creating partnerships and working with communities, and are they interested in having us come do this work? Do we know what is already happening in those communities and what they're already experiencing before we connect with them?
Yeah, and that's such an important sort of thing to recognize, is that representation is important. And I think that it's one piece of the work, though. And I think sometimes, especially if an organization is established, we'll get stuck on this idea of like, we need to diversify our group, which might be true. But I think there are definitely ways to engage empathetically and inclusively within a community. And really, I think that process is active listening. That's what it all boils down to, right? Is hearing the needs of a community, understanding what those needs are, and understanding now the systemic complexities of those needs. And so we can't talk about, for example, creating a program on youth sports after school without talking about systemic issues in class or systemic issues in access to resources like transportation. These are the kinds of things that we need to start sort of shifting our approach on, I think, a bit more.
Hi, Jose. Well, there's a couple questions here. One is a question by Shayna, who's asking if you have any advice for working with minorities that experience scary trauma.
Yeah, I mean, I spend my days looking at trauma after violent events. And so quite literally can be the embodiment of really scary trauma. And so I think it's a matter of allowing people to be vulnerable, but you have a responsibility when you're being vulnerable to then respond appropriately. So it's about active listening and being thoughtful about, well, what does this mean? This is this person's experience. And part of that is contextualizing it and understanding what are the things that play a role in this. A lot of communities that experience violence, it's not one discrete event, right? Violence continues. And so thinking about how do we support someone, but also how do we create a space where, unfortunately, if or when this happens again, they know that this is someone they can talk to. And so really understanding that this is a continual experience among many communities for generations.
Yeah, that sort of the notion of, to me at least, how I hear it is this notion of chronic, right? I mean, it's chronic, ongoing trauma, and it's cumulative, right? And so, at some point the bow's going to break because there's so much weight on it, right? I mean, it's a little bit of a huge challenge. There's a lot of other questions. Crystal asked, what inclusive, empowering strategies do you suggest for asking if, in fact, a community wants to partner with you?
Yeah. I wonder if the question isn't necessarily, do you want to partner, but what things might be helpful in your community? I think that I feel this way as a researcher. Sometimes I get so caught up in theory or terms and processes that I don't sometimes stop and think, does a community even want this work? Because as somebody who's committed to this work, it's like, well, of course we need to do this work. And I think it's a matter of really understanding what are the needs, how would it be most effective to sort of disseminate for this need, and what are ways that feel culturally and community values based that will be accepted by the community. And so really listening and asking thoughtful questions about what would it look like for you if X was resolved in your community, or what would it look like if you had access to mental health care in your community, for example. That's the lens I'm looking at things through. So sorry that I keep mentioning mental health, but that's sort of my bread and butter, so to speak.
Please don't apologize. I think it really helps frame it in a very useful way. With that, actually, we're sort of out of time. I don't know about everyone else. I certainly feel with some of the questions and the comments, people really feel there's a takeaway from you. And one of the takeaways at least I'm going to walk away with is so much importance of listening, right? This active listening. We all say it, but I think it's really hard to do. And I'm pretty sure I only do it about 25% of the time. I'm going to own that. And I think it's really one of those goals one has to keep working at to get better at that. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. I'm going to pass the baton back to Steph and let her walk you through what's coming up next.